Imagine an end-of-year awards show for the most troubled nations on Earth. The award for most totalitarian probably goes to North Korea, the award for most chaotic goes to Myanmar, the award for most aggressive goes to Russia, and the award for most corrupt is of course awarded to South Sudan, albeit with some very, very stiff competition. China gets the nod for being most surveilled, the Central African Republic is deemed the worst place to settle down and start a family, and after lots of debate from the Academy, the United Arab Emirates are awarded this year's Ultimate Medalist Award. But if we were handing out a trophy, a frontsie, if you will, we should do this, to the nation that's the most completely and totally then that award by a country mile goes to Peru. Now, for viewers who haven't checked in on Peru in a little while, can't blame you, we could see how that allegation might feel a little bit out of place. After all, this is the land of Machu Picchu, ceviche, and the natural beauty of Lake Titicaca, where gentle alpacas dot the landscape and rare pink dolphins swim in the rivers. No idea there were pink dolphins, but we've got a distinct suspicion that the Peruvians watching this episode know precisely what we are talking about, and that a fair number of them have already gone to the comment section and said something along the lines of, "Yeah, mate, sounds about right." And that's because, for Peru's absolute miserable last decade, it's been embroiled in a never-ending crisis. Mix together one part instability, one part endemic corruption, one part violence, and you get the absolutely infernal witch's brew that is modern life in Peru. And worst of all, it doesn't seem as if anybody's found the way out. Complete and total chaos. Now, at the outset of today's episode, we got to make one thing very clear. Despite the incredible number of problems that we're going to be laying out today, the nation of Peru actually does have a lot of things going for it. It's a nation that's undergone rapid development in the last several decades, a place with exceptionally abundant natural resources and a rich cultural heritage. It's got a young, growing population, and it's home to a stunning natural landscape and vibrant ecosystem. It's lucky enough to inhabit a corner of the world where even limited conflicts are relatively uncommon, and where all-out war is just practically unheard of. So, as we delve into the ongoing catastrophe that is modern-day Peru, we want to make it very clear that things do not have to be this way. Under better leadership, with better recent decisions and a little more luck, Peru could very well be a rising dynamo on the world stage and a leader in Latin America. On the bright side, that means there's still hope for Peru to right the ship, but at the same time, it just has a way of making this entire situation more tragic. When we start to dig into Peru's many, many problems, we can start by homing in on an issue at the very top: chronic political instability. While it wouldn't be fair to say that all of Peru's modern problems trace back to its years under the late dictator Alberto Fujimori, modern Peru is a place that bears deep scars from Fujimori's time in office, as well as the other trials and turmoil of the 20th century. Like so many other nations that have tried to work their way back from authoritarianism, Peru has had to undo the damage of that time by instituting reforms at all levels and in all sectors of Peruvian society. But like other nations that have experienced something similar, the complexity of rebuilding Peru has meant that there are many, many moving parts, each of which represents a point of failure that can set Peru back for years if all goes wrong. And whether because of nefarious actors within Peru's political system, leaders who've looked at the Fujimori years and wondered whether they could claim that power for themselves, or sometimes just sheer bad luck, Peruvians have watched despairingly as more and more of those potential points of failure have buckled under pressure. After the collapse of the Fujimori regime in the year 2000, Peru went through about a decade and a half of attempts at political reform. The first few years, under long-time Fujimori rival Alejandro Toledo, saw Peru profit from an economic boom while it worked its way back into the global trade networks. But Toledo was horrifically unpopular by the end of his 5-year term, after weathering such an endless volume of political scandals that they would probably make for an episode all their own. Toledo, by the way, would be arrested in 2019 and extradited back to Peru from the United States, and is currently serving 33 years on corruption charges. Peru's next leader, Alan Garcia, was also the guy who had led Peru before Fujimori, but to his credit, his second term went a good deal better than his first attempt. From 2006 to 2011, he presided over impressive economic progress, with Peru eventually gaining recognition as Latin America's fastest-growing economy. But by the time his term ended, he too was quite unpopular, tainted by corruption scandals that Peruvian voters agreed were among the worst in the country's history. He died in 2019 via a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head shortly before he would have been arrested on corruption charges. The guy after Garcia, former counterinsurgent leader and abortive anti-Fujimori coup leader Ollanta Humala, was weak and deeply unpopular during basically his whole presidency, and he too would be arrested on corruption charges less than a year after the conclusion of his term. He was sentenced to 15 years imprisonment in 2025. But if all of that already sounds bad enough, then strap the in, because it gets so much worse after that. In fact, as of now, Humala is the most recent Peruvian leader to serve a full term, and Peru's current political crisis began with the election that was meant to replace him. But by that time, another Fujimori had risen to political prominence in Peru, the former dictator's daughter Keiko, who led a right-wing party called the Fujimorist Popular Force. Although Fujimori the younger was unable to secure the presidency in 2016 and still has never managed to ascend to Peru's highest office, she had already transformed herself into a powerful and obstinate opposition figure by that time. She and her allies had spent the last several years beating the most recent president, Ollanta Humala, into the ground at basically every opportunity, and in 2016 she was initially the odds-on favorite to win the presidency. Ultimately, though, her party was only able to secure a congressional majority, while her rival, Pedro Pablo Kuczynski, was able to ascend to the presidency. By the way, for the remainder of this episode, whenever we refer to a Peruvian politician named Fujimori, we're referring to Keiko Fujimori, not her father. With Kuczynski in control of the executive and Fujimori in control of the legislature, 2016 and 2017 would be a miserable couple of years for Peruvian politics. Kuczynski predictably was implicated in major corruption scandals, as had become the norm for post-dictatorship political leaders. The nation was paralyzed by major strikes, Kuczynski's own government was paralyzed by high-profile resignations, and the largest scandal the Peru had witnessed since the fall of the old dictatorship was uncovered by Brazil's Operation Car Wash, which was bringing down Kuczynski's predecessors and a range of other highly influential national elites. Under Fujimori's leadership, Kuczynski weathered his first impeachment attempt, also due to corruption allegations around the same major scandal, but then faced another impeachment scandal on credible allegations of vote buying. He was forced to resign. When Kuczynski left office, his first vice president, a former regional governor named Martin Vizcarra, ascended to the presidency in his stead. In a move that was both politically wise and probably, in theory, the right thing to do, Vizcarra immediately pivoted toward major anti-corruption reforms with the parallel objectives of cutting the rot out of his own political establishment and reining in the rival Fujimoristas. But despite initial optimism around Vizcarra, you'll notice that we mentioned that his anti-corruption efforts were the right thing to do in theory, because in reality, he quickly overplayed his hand, attempted to dissolve Peru's Congress, and in doing so picked a fight that he just wasn't going to win. Although he did declare the Congress dissolved, the Congress itself refused to recognize the choice, declared Vizcarra suspended from the presidency, and named his vice president, Mercedes Arauz, as Peru's new acting president. Then she declined to serve in the post in order to avoid causing an even larger political crisis, and resigned the vice presidency too. From there, Vizcarra would be accused by Peruvian media of attempting to rewrite the nation's constitution. He would preside over a disastrous outbreak of COVID in 2020 due to systemic issues in Peru that nobody had been able to solve, and he'd then face his first impeachment attempt, led by the brother of former President Humala, with Humala's brother orchestrating that impeachment effort from prison. If all of this is starting to get a little bit confusing, well, we'll refer you to the title of this episode, don't say we didn't warn you. If that first impeachment attempt had succeeded, then because Vizcarra had 0 remaining vice presidents at that time, instead of Peru's usual 2, the presidency would have gone to the new leader of Peru's Congress, Manuel Merino. Unfortunately for Merino, the first attempt failed. Vizcarra was accused of, you guessed it, corruption, but these particular charges didn't stick, mostly because Merino had apparently been reaching out to Peru's armed forces for support and quietly building his own replacement cabinet, which understandably made some lawmakers a bit nervous. Unfortunately for Vizcarra, he was also dealing with a second set of impeachment charges by that time, centered on his gross mismanagement of Peru's COVID response, and of course even more corruption, and 2 months after the first attempt to get rid of him, the second impeachment attempt stuck. That was enough to push congressional leader Manuel Merino to the presidency, but by that time, Merino had succeeded in making himself unbelievably unpopular, with a full 94% of Peruvians disapproving of his rise to the presidency by the time he was inaugurated. After 2 protesters were killed in demonstrations against his leadership, and most of his ministers resigned rather than work under him, Merino made the wise choice to resign his post after just 5 days. He would later be investigated for human rights violations. Because Peru still lacked any vice presidents, the presidency passed to a man who had just become the leader of Peru's Congress, a couple of hours before being elevated to the presidency. Sagasti would finish out the remainder of his presidential term that had started in 2016 as the fourth person to serve as president during that 5-year span. During less than a year in office, Sagasti attempted a handful of reforms, primarily targeting Peru's national police, but he was stonewalled on most of his attempts. He weathered one of the more unique scandals in recent memory when the half-brother of his interior minister was revealed to be a leader of the Shining Path terrorist insurgency, and he failed to secure his own party's nomination in the 2021 election, meaning that the end of that term was the end of his presidency. You never guess what happened to him afterwards? Legal charges. In his case, because of alleged abuses of authority against high-ranking police and military leaders. Kind of refreshing that it wasn't corruption. After a tumultuous few years, Peru's 2021 election was nothing short of a clusterfuck, with Keiko Fujimori running against over a dozen other major candidates, who one regional expert described as including, quote, convicted felons, presumed money launderers, xenophobes, a fascist billionaire, an overrated and outdated economist, a retired mediocre footballer, a person accused of murdering a journalist, and other colorful figures. During the waning days of the election season, Fujimori's prospects would improve significantly after a mass killing in which 18 people were slaughtered and their bodies were left with pamphlets from Peru's Communist Party calling for a boycott of the elections and accusing Fujimori of treason. The increased public support for Fujimori in response to the attack and the damage to the image of their primary rival Pedro Castillo due to the association between Castillo and insurgent violence wasn't quite enough to hand Fujimori the presidency, but the election was close enough that the campaign season hyper-polarized rhetoric and the black marks it left on both the leading candidates would set the tone for an even more bitter few years in the aftermath. Fujimori alleged numerous irregularities in the vote, but it ultimately wasn't enough to prevent her rival, former teacher and union leader Pedro Castillo, from claiming the presidency. A deepening crisis. In retrospect, the chaos and confusion of Peru's prior presidential term from 2016 to 2021 was tame in comparison to the madness that Pedro Castillo would usher in. Although Castillo had risen to prominence as a leader among ordinary people, spearheading a teacher strike in 2017 and then centering his campaign around Peru's under-resourced rural poor, he would ultimately turn out to be one of the leaders who is a far more effective candidate than he was a president. Like his predecessor during the last presidential term, Castillo came into office with a minority government, unable to unify enough of Peru's political parties around a common message, and while he shifted his politics rightward to try and capture the support of evangelical groups and socially conservative political opponents, those efforts never amounted to anything more than the occasional breakthrough bill, usually dealing with minor issues. Instead, Castillo's time in office was characterized, at least in his first year, by sheer political chaos. Within a year of his inauguration, Castillo had left his own political party to lead as an independent. He managed at one point to go through 4 different governments within the span of just 6 months, and his cabinets, initially populated by leftist and even far-left political elements, evolved so far to the right that they basically constituted an abandonment of the same people who'd gotten Castillo elected. If those changes didn't lead to compromise, as Castillo might have hoped, but to a left wing that utterly disdained him as a traitor to his own cause, and a right wing who understood how easily he could be manipulated. As all of this was going on, Castillo was still trying to manage the fallout of the COVID crisis that he had inherited, and he was also the man in charge when Peru was blindsided with another economic crisis. After Russia invaded Ukraine, Peru's economy took a nosedive as essential fuel and fertilizer prices became unsustainably high, just months after it had posted GDP growth of over 11%, prompting Castillo to raise taxes just in time for everything to fall apart. By April of 2022, inflation was reaching record highs and a protest movement was sweeping the nation. And remember, this is all in the span of roughly a single year, during which time Castillo drove Peru's economy and its government into the ground with stunning efficiency. During that time, he was threatened with impeachment twice, although both attempts ultimately failed. But the real madness of Pedro Castillo's time in office came at the end of 2022. At that time, Castillo was under investigation for impeachment for the 3rd time in response to numerous allegations of corruption and scandals involving Castillo and his inner circle. Nationwide protests were still growing in their intensity. The Fujimori faction in Peru's Congress was still as powerful as ever, and Castillo's public approval was as low as any of Peru's other recent presidents' approvals had been during their darkest days. By late 2022, Peru's own Attorney General had accused Castillo of leading a criminal organization and called for his removal, with Castillo claiming that her efforts constituted a coup d'etat. When Castillo's third round of impeachment charges hit, he was subject to 6 different criminal investigations at once. He had churned his way through 5 different cabinets, and he had spent less than 18 months in the presidency. But in the spirit of at least minimum fairness to Castillo, the crisis that ultimately brought him down wasn't a crisis that he started directly. In Peru, the Congress gets to nominate members of the nation's constitutional court, and earlier in 2022, 6 of the court's 7 members had been replaced by the Congress in an attempt to gain indirect leverage over government institutions. That newly antagonistic court got into a series of scraps with Castillo over votes of confidence, and through a process that would probably take more time to explain than it's worth, those scraps eventually created conditions under which Castillo believed he had a legal opportunity to dissolve the Congress. Of course, as Castillo was planning to get rid of them, they were planning to get rid of him, creating such tensions that Peru's chief of the Joint Command warned military leaders that the country was about to be hit by an internal leadership crisis and possibly an internal conflict. On the same day that Peru's Congress was about to censure Castillo, Castillo unilaterally dissolved the Congress, ordered a nationwide curfew, claimed emergency powers, directed the military to stay off the streets, and ordered citizens to give up weapons to the national police. It was a highly dramatic play, but it didn't go the way that Castillo seemed to be expecting. Instead, his actions were condemned almost universally and very quickly as an attempted self-coup, or that is to say using the state's levers of power as an elected head of state to assume a head of state position with far greater or more expansive powers than what's constitutionally allowed. The majority of Castillo's latest cabinet resigned rather than follow his orders. Peru's autonomous ombudsman called his actions an attempted coup, and his vice president, Dina Boluarte, turned on him as well, aided, of course, by the nation's constitutional court. The nation's Congress met as they had initially planned to do, and in the span of a single session, Castillo was censured, impeached, and removed from office. His impeachment passed by a stunning margin, 101 votes in favor and 6 against. According to Peru's successor government, Castillo tried unsuccessfully to flee the country. Instead, he would be arrested, tried for rebellion, and in 2025 he was sentenced to about 11.5 years in prison after being hospitalized for a failed 3-day hunger strike. With Castillo out of office, Peru's presidency transferred to Dina Boluarte, the first woman to ever lead Peru and a career officer at Peru's National Registry of Identification and Civil Status until Castillo had elevated her to the vice presidency and ministerial position in 2022. Ideologically, Boluarte was far from a successor to the far leftist Marxist-Leninist ideology of Castillo's Free Peru party, but she was a perfect successor for the right-leaning, highly appeasement-oriented presidency that Castillo had evolved into during the latter months of his time in office. To put it generously, Boluarte was not a person Peruvians particularly wanted to see leading their country. She had published a book in 2004 that was later found to be over 50% plagiarized. She had lost the only 2 elections that she'd ever taken part in, at the mayoral and then the congressional level, and she had some very clear ties with Peru's corrupt elite, even before she ascended to the presidency. Then, barely a month after she made history as Peru's first woman president, she made history in another way by becoming the first and so far only woman president of Peru to be accused of genocide. During this time, Peru was still dealing with its popular protest movement, with some protesters proudly declaring themselves to be an insurgency and others led by autonomous peasant groups known as rondas campesinas, engaging in regular anti-government strikes. These protests were present everywhere, but Peru's response to the protests under Boluarte was far from uniform. The region that got it worst was Puno, a southern inland region where poorer indigenous communities make up a local majority. As the protest picked up momentum in Puno, looting and vandalism became common, military and police crackdowns became ever more serious in response, and street clashes just became commonplace. Elsewhere in the country, on the 15th of December 2022, soldiers carried out a massacre in the city of Achoco, where 10 people were killed from helicopters during a protest, and from there, the situation worsened substantially. The violence culminated in an event known today as the Juliaca Massacre on the 9th of January 2023, just weeks into Boluarte's time as president. During the massacre, at least 18 civilian demonstrators were shot and killed by the Peruvian National Police, most of them either being ethnic Aymara members of the indigenous population or Bolivians living on Peruvian soil. Because the massacres involved the killings of minority groups by state forces and the injuries of over 100 others in a region where armed forces often engage in anti-indigenous violence, the massacres have since been condemned by human rights and advocacy groups across the globe. But Boluarte's response to the protest movement, as with most of what she'd ultimately do and say during her time in power, was far from what Peruvians might have expected from their leaders. After declaring a state of emergency and postponing elections for 2 years, Boluarte had expressed to the global media that she didn't understand why anybody would protest against her and advocated in favor of actions by soldiers and police that had been roundly condemned as state repression. Boluarte accused Bolivia of fomenting the protests and appointed officials who clearly intended to treat the protest movement as an internal insurgency in the same vein as Peru's historical shining path. Very quickly, Boluarte ended up tying herself in with Peru's military and portions of its elite who were inclined toward anti-indigenous policy to the point that she became dependent on them for her political survival. And once that happened, a process that, by the way, took place with stunning speed, Boluarte was in the pocket of the same people who'd had their way with presidents past, except that Boluarte had neither the personal will nor the political capital to even attempt to strike out on her own. For nearly 3 years, Boluarte would preside over an even more complete co-opting of the Peruvian state, with corporate interests, organized crime, and the nation's political elite all growing more deeply entwined than they'd ever been before. Personally, Boluarte endured an endless series of scandals, disappearing for 2 weeks to go and get plastic surgery, wearing luxury Rolex watches at public events after they'd been gifted to her by national elites, going through several corrupt prime ministers, defending her brother as he was implicated in a collusion scandal, and in March of 2024, getting raided by the police as part of a search and seizure order. At the same time, Boluarte proved unable to stop the pro-Fujimori political opposition from consolidating the power of government in Peru's Congress, which then used the perceived threat of Peru's protest movement as a pretext to avoid any and all talk of reform, integrate the armed forces into civil government, and establish a range of new repressive policies to constrain popular opposition to the government. Protesting was ultimately made illegal, the formerly independent National Board of Justice was brought under control of the Congress, and the old Fujimori dictatorship was made immune from prosecution on charges of crimes against humanity. All the while, the Congress consistently protected Boluarte from any serious political scrutiny or attempted impeachment, knowing that she was both a willing and an extremely compliant political ally. Under Boluarte's watch, organized criminal elements in Peru gained massively in their power, violent crime surged nationwide, and transnational syndicates turned Peru into a core part of their operations, sometimes even the heart of their respective networks. Boluarte herself reached rock-bottom approvals in March of 2025, estimated as low as 2%, where she would stay for the rest of her tenure. But inevitably, the Peruvian government's approach to the situation, shifting popular outrage onto Boluarte to keep themselves aloof, meant that Boluarte would outlive her usefulness sooner or later. And that's what eventually happened in October 2025, when, on October the 8th, 4 members of a popular band were wounded by assailants on a motorcycle in a public drive-by, along with a concert attendee and a bartender. Although none of the people shot in the attack died, it prompted massive outrage from both the music industry and the Peruvian public as a glaring example of the systemic state failures that had led Peru to this moment. Seeing that the public was well and truly incensed by what had happened, the congressional blocs that had been previously protecting Boluarte decided that this was the moment to throw her out of office in order to absolve themselves of further responsibility. Within 2 days of the shooting, Boluarte was out on her own. Impeached with 121 votes against her, 0 in favor, and 0 abstentions. As of now, Boluarte remains in Peru, and given the overwhelming crush of investigations that she's now dealing with, it appears unlikely that she'll be able to avoid jail time. Boluarte's successor was the man who had led Peru's Congress up until her impeachment, 38-year-old Jose Jerry. At the time that he took office, Jerry was the 8th Peruvian president to assume the role within the span of a single decade, and as of the time of writing, about 3 months after his elevation, he is still in office. Jerry has pledged a war on crime under his leadership and has urged a focus on national reconciliation. But experts on Peru and its political crisis broadly agree that Jerry's public statements are simply window dressing. Jerry's own history of personal scandals, including a sexual assault case, a Boris Johnson-esque COVID controversy, and allegations of, wait for it, corruption and bribery. Moreover, he was quite literally the leader of the same Congress that used Boluarte as a cover to do whatever it wanted, a position that he only got by the way, a little bit under 2 months before Boluarte was kicked out. That timeline does raise real questions about his presidency. Was he simply chosen to be the next scapegoat? And was there already a plan in motion to get rid of Boluarte when convenient, with the October shootings just functioning as a trigger for that process to begin? Either way, it appears that Jerry is little more than a figurehead. He's not expected to be a reformer. He's already leveraged states of emergency to expand federal powers in Lima and along the Chilean border, and as of now, he's hardly engaged in even token anti-corruption actions. As of now, he's scheduled to serve in his post until Peru's next set of presidential elections on the 12th of April 2026. He did not file to run in the upcoming cycle. Corruption, violence, and more of the same. Zoom all the way out, take a long look at the absolute insanity that is modern Peruvian politics, and you'll be well within your right to ask the question, why does this keep happening? And perhaps, even more important, is there any hope for change? After all, if Peru's looking at an election cycle this very April, then perhaps there's a chance that life in the country could all go back to normal. Unfortunately, though, our scheme isn't typically the bearer of good news, and we simply can't change that today. Although there's certainly an outside chance that Peru's next leader will start to turn things around, that leader will still have to grapple with the corruption and increasingly the violence that dominates Peru's political landscape. And they might even be participants in either or both. Although Peru doesn't rank quite as badly on corruption as Venezuela, for example, or South Sudan, it's at the absolute bottom of the list among countries that can at least credibly claim not to be fully autocratic. Among nations that still hold relatively fair, relatively free elections and have at least some degree of a functioning government, the severity of Peru's endemic corruption is staggering, and quite frankly, the situation is more characteristic of a nation sliding into authoritarianism than one that has any decent chance of recovery. If Peru has any saving grace where corruption is concerned, it's the fact that unlike the old dictatorship, Peru simply lacks a dominant leader to centralize that corruption. Because the country is divided among many corrupt groups trying to compete for a share of the pie, degradation happens more slowly, and corrupt factions can't get ahead quite as fast because they're constantly undercutting each other. But that situation also comes with a hell of a downside, because the entire Peruvian political system is so dependent on internal corruption, it's practically impossible to get ahead or even survive unless you're willing to play the game. So although Peru is backsliding slower than another similarly corrupt nation might have done, everybody in proximity to power today is a part of the problem. Making matters worse, the presidency and eventual replacement of Dina Boluarte was a symptom of another rising problem across Peru. The fact that most, if not all, corrupt elites seem to have realized that when internal power struggles become too severe, that competition cuts into everyone's profit. Instead, Dina Boluarte spent years very obviously serving as the government's unpopular avatar, holding the presidency and acting as a sort of lightning rod for outrage, while the rest of the country's elite took full advantage of the lack of scrutiny to simply do whatever they pleased. Boluarte herself appeared to gain massively from serving in that role, at least before she was discarded, and now Jose Jerry appears to have stepped up to fill basically the same core purpose. As journalist Simeon Dagal explained in 2023 via Foreign Policy, quote, "Wherever you look in Peru, it is impossible to miss the country's rampant graft, which, with a handful of exceptions, has metastasized into almost all public institutions. This corruption has until now been largely accepted, or at least tolerated, by a jaded citizenry who have summed it up with the well-worn phrase, 'He steals but carries out public works.'" Those problems have only gotten worse since Dagal's analysis of the situation was published, and specific issues spotlighted in that analysis, dividing lines of race, class, and geography, deliberate sabotage of public policy, and exploitation of public funds, even when they're set aside for important services, have only become more obvious. That corruption isn't just present in Peru's federal government. Local police and inspectors, small-time politicians, municipal officials, and everybody else in a position of power can simply be assumed to be on the game. The role of bribery has become a fact of life, not just for Peruvian businesses, but for ordinary people who need to come into contact with the state. When high-level officials are investigated by prosecutors that actually intend to secure a conviction, they usually end up being involved with numerous scandals at once, but as Peru's many recent former presidents have learned, prosecuting one high-level leader provides the excuse for hundreds of lower-level officials to continue getting away with whatever they're engaged in. Trials are mostly a matter of public spectacle, providing power systems with the ability to say, "See, we've done something about the problem," even when they're engaged in little more than a token performance of accountability. But when we turn our attention to violence, the problem still manages to get worse because of the highly enticing proposition that these same corrupt officials get to consider. If prosecution for corrupt abuses seems rare, and corrupt officials are practically never held accountable for abuses of the legitimate state system, then what's to stop them from pursuing illicit or extra-legal profits as well? Back in 2024, a group of Peruvian business associations issued a dire warning telling the country that it was, quote, losing the battle against organized crime. At that time, the Peruvian government had been forced to bring in the military to attempt to deal with a massive wave of business extortions in the capital city of Lima, especially targeting bus drivers. Those business leaders claimed that they, quote, live under siege from organized crime, which has taken control of the country in the alarming absence of the state. But while those trade associations were entirely correct about the rise of crime across Peru, it may not have been as accurate to say that Peruvian authorities were losing the battle. In order to lose the battle against organized crime, you've got to be fighting the battle against organized crime, and it's not clear at all that that's what's been happening. Turn the clock forward to the summer of 2025, and Human Rights Watch issued its own dire warning that, quote, Peru's Congress is undermining the independence and capacity of judges and prosecutors to fight organized crime. In a 43-page report published at the same time, Human Rights Watch went into great detail on all the ways that the Peruvian government under Dina Boluarte at that time had eroded public institutions, climate protections, and other state services that stood in the way of organized crime, while failing catastrophically in its efforts to actually fight criminal groups on the ground. As the report noted, more than half of Peru's congressional lawmakers were facing corruption or criminal investigations at that time, but the tools to investigate and prosecute them have grown all the weaker. In 2025, homicide and extortion rates continued to rise even further, and it's not hard to see why organized syndicates might go to those lengths to establish control and protect their profits. Peru is the second largest producer of cocaine on Earth. It's a hub for illegal gold mining. It's a critical node in sexual slavery and organ trafficking networks, and it's a place where ordinary people often find themselves working under conditions tantamount to modern slavery. The fact that Peru fosters this level of organized crime is hardly a new phenomenon. In large part, it's a holdover from a corrupt authoritarian regime that was never sufficiently purged of untrustworthy officials. But no matter the history, Peru's current leadership has chosen to continue and even deepen its relationship with organized crime. Border officials, law enforcement, and municipal authorities regularly work hand in hand with these same criminal groups, and while their connections to national leaders are somewhat more murky, it's hardly a coincidence that multiple ex-Peruvian presidents have been convicted of crimes in connection to organized syndicates. Even worse, transnational gangs across Latin America have been looking for a new place to make into the core of their regional networks, as those gangs have been pushed out of some of Latin American countries and face at least some resistance in others, like in Ecuador or Chile. Peru, by contrast, is a highly permissive environment, and it's a place with so many connections to the rest of the region and the world, plus so much economic potential, that for these syndicates, the capture of the Peruvian state is just a dream come true. When we look ahead to the 2026 elections, the harsh reality is that none of the likely finalists are outsiders, and all of them have spent years allegedly enriching themselves as part of these same systems, or worse, as the head of the system. The polling leader at the time of writing is Rafael López Aliaga, the former mayor of Lima. López Aliaga resigned from the mayor's post last October to make a run for the presidency after presiding over the same skyrocketing homicides and extortions that forced the city into a state of emergency. He's been investigated for tax evasion, money laundering, and calling for the death of now former President Pedro Castillo. And while he's called for anti-crime crackdowns in the same vein as El Salvador's Nayib Bukele and dressed up as a pig to call out corrupt leaders, he's hardly a trustworthy anti-corruption candidate. As an aside, he also states that he practices daily self-flagellation as repentance of the flesh. So that's a fun fact. López Aliaga will compete against the candidate polling in second place, Keiko Fujimori, the same congressional leader that has overseen the repeated co-opting of Peruvian presidents as a shield for state corruption and has led the effort to substantially weaken Peruvian state institutions. Neither candidate is polling particularly well, but the two of them are likely to move into a runoff, and even if they don't, the next two high-polling candidates aren't much better. One of them, Mario Vizcarra, was closely tied to the corruption scandals of his brother, ex-President Martin Vizcarra, and while the other, Carlos Alvarez, is an outsider candidate who's running after a successful career in comedy, it's frankly not likely that he'll have the political capital to resist the all-encompassing corruption of the Peruvian state, even if he captured the presidency. If you're a new Peruvian president, even with the worst intentions, you don't get to corrupt the state. The state corrupts you. It was corrupt before you, and it'll be corrupt after you. It's in that final piece of the conversation, as we weigh the options for Peru's political future, that we find the most discouraging reality of all. Corrupt systems, no matter the country, seek to preserve themselves, their profits, and their power. And the deeper that corruption goes, the more difficult it is to break out of. Peru's long political crisis isn't just a tale of batshit presidents and domestic upheaval, it's the story of how a massive and deeply corrupt national elite managed to break leader after leader after leader and force all of them into submission or out of office. Peru's corruption isn't the worst in the world, not even close, but it is one of, if not the most corrupt of any nation that's supposed to pass for a democracy. In a state that broken, that thoroughly exploited, it takes a miracle for a surprise presidential candidate to even make it into office. And if that outsider candidate seeks to make a change, then the day of their inauguration will become the day that they truly arrive in their personal hell. When we chose the title of today's episode, we weren't kidding. Peru is f***ed. And if it's ever going to be un-f***ed, then it'll take a far greater miracle than the 2026 election is likely to provide. Thank you for watching.